Well, hi everyone. My name's Kate Hall. I'd love to welcome you to our MWA New York chapter of Crime Craft. Today we have a really exciting guest. Stephanie Scott-Snyder is with us today. Um, she is a forensic mental health clinician and criminal behavior expert with 15 years of experience conducting psychological risk assessment and providing court-ordered therapy to violent offenders. She specializes in issues related to sexual and domestic violence, as well as violence committed by women, and has consulted on both serial rape and homicide cases. Scott-Snyder is a member of the VIDOC Society, through which she profiles cold case homicides to assist law enforcement. She's also a behavioral science expert with the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute, where she was recently part of the team that closed a 25-year-old homicide. Additionally, she works with the Cold Case Foundation to train federal law enforcement as part of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Initiative. She also frequently trains mental health practitioners, victim advocates, and court personnel. Stephanie is an adjunct professor at Lehigh and DeSales universities and is the author of two textbooks, Introduction to Forensic Psychology, Essentials for Law Enforcement, and When Women Offend, Crime and the Female Perpetrator. For the latter, she spent months interviewing women convicted of uncharacteristically violent crimes. Prior to her work in forensic psychology, she was a writer, producer, and creative director for network television and worked on projects including Forensic Files, Body of Evidence, The First 48, and Cold Case Files. She's also a member of ITW and Sisters in Crime. We're so excited to have Stephanie here with us today. Today, we're going to be talking about inside the criminal mind. So, Stephanie, let's get started.
All right, I am going to hopefully share my PowerPoint. Can you see that?
Yeah, we're up.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with violent offenders today. Um, for that reason, you heard what I specialize in. I do want to give a trigger warning. If you feel disturbed, upset, uncomfortable, I'm not going to be offended if you sign off or take a little walk. That's fine. Um, I'm a fiction writer also, so I'm trying to give you some things that I think may be helpful in developing your characters. So typically, when we talk about the criminal mind, people picture these deviant individuals, lurking in dark alleyways. That's not what the criminal mind is. Individuals like that are few and far between. Um, More typically, we have the everyday person who commits a murder, a robbery, whatever it is. And so up on the screen, I have a list of some of the more common motives that I've seen specifically for murder over the years. And just to show you how two very different people might have the same motive. Let's take money. This is probably the most common motive for murder. You might have an individual who wants to collect on an insurance payment and it's cold-blooded. And so they go and they kill their spouse because they know that they're the beneficiary. Then you might have a parent who has never broken the law, never been aggressive toward anyone, but they need to kill someone to get money to pay for an operation that would save their child. The difference in these individuals, aside from psychological diagnoses, the difference is what they tell themselves before or after the crime in order to get away with it. So the person who just wants the insurance money, they're probably going to justify what they're doing. They're going to say, I deserve it. Maybe their spouse has been a pain in the neck. Maybe their spouse is older and they're thinking, well, it's not like I'm killing a 25-year-old. So they're going to justify it. Even though those things are false, to them, they are going to start to believe those to let them commit this act. The parent is probably going to minimize. They're going to say that killing someone else is not as bad as their child dying. It's still bad. They can still acknowledge that, but it has to be better than the alternative, which would be their sick child not being saved. All criminals lie. They lie before the crime and they lie after the crime. So some of these things I think are pretty common sense. After a crime or even while they're planning it, a criminal might lie because they want to escape punishment. They don't want to get caught. They want to refocus the police on someone else. They want to get released on parole. They want to stay out on parole and not lose privileges. Some things that I think are really interesting, though, is that they'll also lie to save face with their peers. So there's a prison near me that they have something called Face Sheet Fridays. A face sheet is the single piece of paper included in an inmate's file that has their mugshot on it and then just a list of the charges. No description, it might just say aggravated assault or criminal homicide, first degree, something like that. So every Friday, there's some free time where they're all in this sort of day room area, and everyone takes their face sheets and they put them down on the table and they all go through each other's business. And so I've had people tell me that they have their face sheet, but they never put it out. They lie to say that they don't have it, their attorney never gave it to them, because they know that others will look at their crime as less than. There's a prison hierarchy. And at the very bottom are people who have harmed children in any way. And so I've spoken with people who have done things like that, and they have lied. They've lied to their peers and said, no, I killed my wife, or, I assaulted somebody in a bar, because they're saving face with their peers. And then some people lie because they're ashamed. And this is something that I didn't realize until I had been working in this field for quite a while. Um, there are certain crimes, very often sex crimes, that the individual will lie to themselves. So they'll minimize and justify because they're so ashamed. There is a lot of shame in sexual violence for both the victim, the survivor, as well as the offender. So there's this sort of dichotomy almost. All the reasons I just listed, these are non-psychopaths. This is why non-psychopaths lie. Psychopaths, however, which they're very common in mysteries and thrillers, so I want to talk about them a little bit today. Psychopaths lie because they can and because they enjoy it. So, as we're going to talk about psychopaths, throw out everything you have ever heard about them, that they are made of stone, that they feel nothing. That's not necessarily the case. So, psychopaths are social predators. They will violate someone else's rights to get what they want. They don't feel remorse. They don't feel empathy. And they're chameleons, which is really interesting because they will act toward you, however, will get you to give them what they want. And they might be a completely different person when they're in the room with someone else. I've heard a lot of people say that they knew someone was a psychopath when they walked in the room because they got, the hairs on the back of their neck stood up. I'm not going to say that's not true, but I am going to say that it's highly unlikely for that to happen the first time you're in the room with a psychopath. And the reason is that under their traits, the first thing is superficial charm. And you see that they're cunning, they're manipulative, they are charming, and they're not, all of them are not above average in intelligence, but at least average. So they know how to play someone. They know how to work a room. You're much more likely to feel captivated, intrigued, drawn to a psychopath until the mask slips. This is something that a lot of people don't realize because they use the words psychopath and sociopath interchangeably. Psychopaths are born, sociopaths are made. So, psychopathy is a brain dysfunction that is born into someone. Um, Essentially, what happens is they don't experience arousal of their autonomic nervous system. What that means is when you or I are driving down the street and we see the flashing red and blue lights in the rearview mirror, we know we're about to be pulled over. We get stressed. So, what happens? Your heart races, your breathing gets faster, maybe a little bit shallow. Your palms might sweat. Your pupils dilate. You might be shifting in your seat. These are typical physiological stress responses. Psychopaths don't have them. That part of their brain just doesn't light up in a stressful situation. Um, I like to think of it as they're half in the bag all the time. So they need more and more and more stimulation. First of all, they need more stimulation than the average person to feel any kind of satisfaction. But then they almost build up a tolerance, which will tie back to why criminal psychopaths commit serial offenses. Um, in addition, they don't process emotional information. So emotions are almost like a foreign language to them. They can mimic it, they can hear the sounds and try to form them, but they don't understand the words. It's the same experience as if you've been in a foreign country and you're like, I keep hearing something that sounds like whatever it is, but I don't know what it means. Because psychopaths are usually smart, they're very good at mimicking emotions. There is a great book, it's on my shelf. It's called I Know a Secret by Tess Gerritsen. And she writes a psychopath character who talks about how they're observing people at a funeral so that they can learn how to act because they're not feeling the sadness. They don't have that depth of emotion. So, because their brains need more and more stimulation, and because they lack empathy, their crimes tend to be more callous and they build in terms of severity, violence. They may even involve torture further down the road. Sorry, there we go. So I want to just compare narcissists and psychopaths and finish with the comparison of sociopaths to psychopaths. So narcissists do understand emotion. Narcissists are made. And typically, their capacity for empathy is limited, but it's as a result of their lived experience. So everything in their world focuses on them because typically at an early age, they endured what we would call a narcissistic or a psychic injury. This often takes the form of some kind of verbal abuse coupled with humiliation. And so they see their abuser as having this power when they put them down. And so the narcissist develops this very self-centered view of the world. And if I can make you feel badly, it makes me more powerful. And so that's why the narcissist acts. Similarly, the sociopath is made. Sociopaths that I've worked with have been born with empathy, but have learned to kind of tamp that down because of their environment. Um, I've seen a lot of like young male sociopaths who grew up in abusive households, so they turned to the streets. joined a gang, and in order to fit in with the gang and be protected by the gang, they had to not feel empathy and go out and commit all of the various crimes that a gang may instruct them to do. So I'm going to talk about one of my cases. I have changed a lot of the information, but you'll still get the idea. Okay, so PK. PK is a psychopath. PK has the mentality to be a serial killer. However, he was caught before that happened. So PK targeted adult males, which is very common for psychopaths. Non-psychopaths tend to target women and children or people who are more helpless because it evens out their odds, whereas the psychopath enjoys the struggle. So often they'll go after adult males. So PK was luring men to his house under the guise of paying them for sex. And it started out where he would drug them and leave them somewhere where they were lost just because it was fun. You know, this person's going to wake up and they're going to be really confused. And he was toying with them, he was having fun. And that graduated to a sexual assault and use of force. And then the next time, the sexual assault wasn't enough for him to feel satisfied emotionally. He was getting bored because boredom is an issue for psychopaths. And so he actually slit the person's throat and he dumped the body. The next time, and this is why I say he's a would-be serial killer, he put something heavy, I forget what it was, on the person so that they were right up against the train tracks. They would have been hit by a train. And he enjoyed seeing them there and the fear. He was feeding off of their fear. But something else is really interesting about this because so the train stopped. Okay, so nobody was killed, which is why he's a would-be serial killer. He wasn't afraid, though, of anyone on the train seeing him, recognizing him, nothing like that. And so there was a manhunt that went on for quite some time. And he got bored again of seeing this on the news. He got bored of hearing people talk about it. And so he went to the police and he pretended to be a witness. And he was just messing with them. He just really enjoyed watching them spin out of control and take the investigation in a new direction. And it was feeding his ego. And ego is very important to psychopaths. They're grandiose. They need that. And of course, the police believed him initially because he's intelligent, able to mimic appropriate emotions, and charismatic. So he came across as believable and helpful. Okay, so now you've heard about psychopathic offenders and what that looks like. But now I want to look at some cases I've worked with non-psychopathic offenders. So you can see the difference. So the first one, I'm going to call him Mr. Smith, was home on military leave. He had served multiple tours of duty in combat zones. He invited a friend over to watch the game, and there was a commotion in the game. The friend shouted, very excited, and Mr. Smith, I was going to call the last offender PJ, and I ended up with PK. So Mr. Smith grabs a lamp and smashes it over this guy's head. As soon as he kind of realizes what he did, he called 911. He was very remorseful. When he was talking to me, and his friend did unfortunately die, when he was talking to me about it, he described it as tunnel vision. So he had a history of PTSD. And he said that he was functioning almost on autopilot. So this is someone who has a mental health diagnosis that played into their crime, but they have remorse. Had he not had PTSD, I think it's very unlikely that he ever would have hurt someone. Okay, now I'm going to talk about Mr. Jones. You can see I was very creative with these names. So Mr. Jones has a history of depression. Um, he couldn't afford to go see a psychiatrist, so he was not properly medicated. So he was doing what a lot of people do, which was self-medicating with street drugs and different drugs. Um, so one night his friend said, I'm going to go rob a convenience store. And he said, okay, I'll go with you because he was very blah, feeling very blah, which is that's a more common symptom of depression than sadness. So he said, all right, I'm going to go. And they got some money and they said, oh, well, okay, that was kind of cool. So then they decided they were going to rob another one. And then he ended up shooting the cashier because the cashier kind of gave them a hard time. And when I spoke with him after this had happened, he said, I don't care what happens to me. Why would I care what I did to someone else? And that's the danger with depression. A lot of times people say, oh, that person was so quiet, I never would have suspected. And my question is always, but were they depressed? All right, so let's talk about Mr. Johnson. Okay, so Mr. Johnson burned down a store in his hometown in the middle of the night. I don't think that the thought that someone might be there doing inventory was in his head. Um, he had a history of psychosis. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia with command hallucinations, which means that he was not only hearing voices, but those voices were telling him what to do. And that's really the only time that I get concerned that someone with schizophrenia may hurt someone else is if the voices are telling them to do harmful things. As a side note, people with schizophrenia are not at all likely to hurt someone else. We tend to hear about, the really over the top cases like Son of Sam, where he said his neighbor's dog told him to kill people. Someone with schizophrenia is far more likely to hurt themselves by scratching. They often have tactile hallucinations where they feel like bugs are crawling under their skin. So they might scratch themselves or they might physically assault a caretaker who's trying to stop them from doing that. So, anyway, going back to Mr. Johnson, once he was arrested, he was medicated in the county jail. So, once he was lucid, he said that his dead brother had told him he had to burn the store down, otherwise, they would get him. He didn't know who they were. That just plays into the paranoia that is often associated with schizophrenia. And then I'm going to talk about Mr. Williams. So, this is actually an incomplete sexual assault. This is an attempted rape. So, he was fixated on a woman that he worked with, but he was scared to ask her out, but he just kept watching her to the point where he was stalking her. And then he started the dangerous part is before the stalking, but the more dangerous part is that he started to fantasize a relationship with her to the point that he believed he was having a relationship with her. So he went and he rented the apartment next door. He accidentally, on purpose, kept running into her roommate. And he actually asked the roommate out on a date, got invited back to the girl's apartment. And then as he left the door unlocked. And then he slipped back in the middle of the night, and his would-be victim woke up with him on top of her, but he hadn't done anything yet. And when she yelled at him, he started to apologize because in his head, they were in this relationship together and he wanted her to continue to like him. So now we've talked about psychopathic and non-psychopathic men. So now I want to talk about women. I've done a lot of research on violent women. Um, Women tend to get away with a lot of things. And the reason is that as a society, we think of women as being caregivers, nurturing, mothers, nurses, teachers. We're sort of stuck in that mentality. And from what I've seen, um, I have this theory that gender does play a part in most crimes committed by women, but not necessarily in the way you would think. So I think the first trajectory of women who offend, those women use gender to their advantage. They know how people view women and they use that to get closer to their victims, to avoid suspicion. This is your Black Widow serial killer who cares for her victim as she poisons him over months and months. And then there are women who are usually the victims of some kind of gender-based violence themselves. And then they either commit domestic homicide and they kill their abuser, or they are trafficking victims and then they start trafficking other girls in order to stop the abuse that's happening to them. So this is Amy. I have permission to share her story. She was one of my research subjects. Um, I visited her in prison. I spoke with her at length, and I'm going to play a little clip of her talking about how she views herself and what she did. The clip is, I don't know, probably a minute and a half.
Okay, my name is Amy, and I am in prison for 3 counts of murder and 1 count of sexual misconduct with a minor. And I've been incarcerated now for 18 and a half years. I was 23 years old when I decided to get out of my marriage with my husband of 5.5 years. I was an alcoholic and I was a pot smoker, and I started experimenting with pills such as Adipex and Valiums and pain pills like Lortabs and Darvocets. And I got into a sexual affair with a 16-year-old boy who lived across the street from me. And due to my addiction and my sexual affair outside of my husband, it distanced myself from my husband, from his family, and from my family, and my addiction changed my relationship with my children.
Okay, so a couple things I want you to notice. She speaks extremely slowly, and I'm going to talk about why that is. Her choice of wording is very interesting. Her addiction changed her relationship with her children. She kind of glossed over this triple homicide charge conviction. So what she should have said is, my relationship with my children is gone because I killed my entire family. That's what she should have said. She burned down the house with her whole family in it. So, during our interview, I was obviously recording and I didn't think my tape recorder was working at first. So I stopped it and I said to her, gee, I'm really sorry. Can you just, introduce yourself and talk about your crime one more time so I can make sure I have it on tape? She said, absolutely. And she repeated everything verbatim. So I knew right then this is very rehearsed. You notice that she's presenting herself as the victim. She's sort of taking responsibility for her addiction, but in this tale that she tells, her addiction is the bad guy. She kept telling me that, because I talked to her for a long time. She kept telling me that she gets very upset when people say that she's a bad mother. And I was like, wow, that's one way to look at things. So, why is it important that she's talking so slowly and she's rehearsed? Well, we talked about lying before. So, detecting deception is something that I do regularly when I'm with a patient doing therapy, when I'm doing a risk assessment, when I'm working a cold case. When someone is not a psychopath, and Amy is not a psychopath, I look for three things when they're talking: fight or flight responses, cognitive complexity, and impression management. And impression management is what Amy does. So, fight or flight, we've all heard this term before. It's that automatic response to stress. So, this can look like a decrease in salivation. Something that I notice is if I am in a very small, closed room interviewing someone and they're getting nervous, their breath will get worse and worse as we talk, as they get more and more nervous. They might be swallowing very deeply. They might appear very thirsty. They might be fidgeting. Gross body movements. So this is a picture of Jodi Arias, and this is the interrogation after she had killed her boyfriend, Travis Alexander, and she's doing a headstand. And this is a physical release of stress. And some people say it's the stress because she was arrested. I would argue and say it's stress because she was lying too. Now, it's dangerous to just look at one of these things and say, well, they're swallowing a lot. They keep asking for water. They could also be on medication. Someone who's fidgeting, maybe they're stressed out from lying. Maybe they have ADHD. So we look at multiple things. Cognitive complexity. So lying is a lot harder than telling the truth. When you tell a lie, you have to suppress the truth, you have to plan the lie, and then you have to tell it in a truthful way. Telling the truth just requires that you remember what happened. When people lie, when people who are not psychopaths lie, they tend to keep it very simple. What they heard or what they saw, they don't include other senses or spatial relationships about the event. And they typically don't include details of social interactions like, oh, he was very warm and kind to me. They're not going to say things like that. It's going to be very straightforward. So if your sleuth is questioning someone who's not a psychopath and who's lying, they might want to ask, well, so how did it smell there? Or, well, how did that person treat you? How close was the crime scene to whatever location? And they're going to have a hard time answering. Then we come to impression management. So this is when someone rehearses what they're going to do, and they are literally trying to manage the impression that you get of them. And so this is what Amy does. There's a change in her rate of speech. Her vocal pitch, she sounds very much like a little girl because she's trying to sound innocent. Something that many offenders over the years have said to me is, oh, I'm always sure that I don't break eye contact when I'm talking to the cops. Well, that's not normal though. People look at you, look away, and so you can tell too, Zero eye contact, of course, if someone has autism, then that is going to happen. Or making very intense eye contact, something that is different from how this person normally presents. So, um, so you saw how that looks with Amy. And then this is a very, very famous example of impression management. And I'm sorry I don't have a recording of it, but when Clinton says this is about what happened between him and Monica Lewinsky. I did not have, and he slows it down there, sexual relations, kind of a strange wording, with that woman, which is distancing language. If he were telling the truth, he would probably say, I didn't have sex with Monica Lewinsky. So you can see the difference. Of course, again, this would not apply to a psychopath because they don't get stressed out. So when a psychopath is lying, there's no flight or fight response. There is no difficulty with cognitive complexity. They tell very, very detailed stories, but the difference is that their aim is to shock you. So I worked with an individual. We were in group therapy. He got annoyed because someone else was speaking in the group. And he said, well, before I came here, I kicked my pregnant girlfriend in the stomach. Horrifying, shocking. You know, there was a collective gasp in the room. And of course, he didn't have a girlfriend. There was nobody that was injured. There was no baby that was harmed. So these are the types of things that they'll say, and it's to get a rise out of you. They want to make you uncomfortable. They will find your weakness and they will exploit it every single time. In terms of impression management, they are consistently playing the hero or the victim in their stories. And because they're so charming, a lot of people are drawn in by that and feel bad about that. You know, they'll feel bad for them. But it's a sign of impression management. So when you have a psychopath in the room, or when your sleuth has a psychopath in the room, they want to look to see if the emotions are matching the words. So, for example, I had an individual who had broken into someone's apartment. He just wanted to rob it, but there was someone home, and he ended up shooting her. And as he recounted it to me, he told me how she begged for her life, how there were photos all over the place of her young children. And then he proceeded to tell me how much blood there was and the sounds that he heard because he wanted to upset me. He wanted me to lose the conversation, essentially. That's what he wanted. And then he said, so he's smiling throughout this entire story. And then with a very, very flat affect, he goes, I regret that. He might as well have said, it's raining today. So if the words don't match the emotion or the look of emotion, you might be dealing with a psychopath. So every time I have had a conversation with a psychopath, and they're about 1% of the general population, but in the prison and parole populations, they're 15 to 25%. So I've seen a fair share of psychopaths over the years. They will always, always try to play a game of cat and mouse. They're going to try to turn the tables. If I ask them a question, they'll ask me one right back, and they will try to make it very personal. They want to make me uncomfortable. Like I said, they say things for shock value. If you are questioning a psychopath and trying to catch them in a lie, give them enough rope to hang themselves. They like being the center of attention. They want to talk. Let them keep talking because the more they talk, the more they're going to lie. And the more times they're going to contradict themselves. So confront them calmly, but repeatedly, because one, questioning them is going to make them angry. They won't like that, and you'll see that mask slip. They're also going to get bored of repeating themselves, and they might be tempted to say something else that can be used in court. There's something else I wanted to tell you. Oh, okay. So never react when a psychopath says something, to upset you. If your sleuth is in the room and says to a psychopath, really, just tell me where the body is buried so that I can give closure to the family. Well, now they're going to be sure not to tell you or to send you on a wild goose chase because they don't care even a little bit if the family gets closure. They can't be trusted. They are always, always, always playing an angle. So just keep them talking, and it's almost like pulling a pin out of a grenade, and eventually they just explode. And that's it. And that's my email if anybody has questions or anything. And I think I saw some questions pop up in the chat.
Stephanie, thank you so much. That was incredible. So I'm going, if you want to, I'll put your email in the chat.
Okay. Should I start sharing?
Yep, you can do that. And then I'll go through I'll go through the chat. Sorry guys, that's gmail.com. Sorry, gmail.com. So let's take a look. It said one person actually brought up OJ, and I don't want to open up a can of worms with that. But would, in your opinion, is OJ, what would be his profile if, assuming that he was guilty?
So I was a freshman in high school when OJ was arrested. I am not super familiar with the case, but I do know that there was a history of domestic violence there. So my belief would be that there is some power and control. He's a very wealthy individual, very famous. I would probably think hot-blooded murder, at least traits of narcissism.
Okay, interesting.
If he's guilty, there's the qualifier.
Right, right. So Jeannie wanted you to elaborate on the ordered versus the disordered mind, criminal mind. Is that something that you can speak to?
Do you mean organized and disorganized?
Yes, I think so. I think that's
Okay,
correct.
perfect. So organized, disorganized, this is a dichotomy that was developed by the FBI years ago to help in criminal profiling. And so what you do is you read the behavioral evidence at the crime scene to determine the mental status of the offender. So an organized offender has an organized crime scene. I'm going to put a caveat in there saying that there are always elements of both, but in general, an organized offender has planned what they're doing. So they may have stalked their victims and chosen them. It may have taken them quite a long time. They probably brought the weapon with them. They may have staged the crime scene to throw off law enforcement. They are typically very controlled in their emotions. They are intelligent, and they are usually the firstborn or only child in a family, which gets a little woo-woo, but there are reasons behind that because they are so independent. They are geographically mobile. They are typically employed. They are typically either married or cohabitating with a partner. they appear very normal. BTK talks about this. He calls it cubing, where he had his serial killer persona and then his church elder persona and then his husband and his father, and they were all sides of the same. Um, a disorganized offender. This is someone who is not planning. This is someone who does not have good control over their emotions. This is someone who might leave a very sloppy crime scene. They might dump a body where it's going to be it's going to be found. Maybe before it would be beneficial for them to have time to get away. Um, there in one of the books I wrote, this one, in this one, um, I use an example that there is someone who goes into this house and they kill the woman who lives there. There's a bottle of wine out on the table. When the woman's family gets there, oh, and there are also family photographs that are face down and blood is on the back of them. So we know they were put down before the murder happened. What we come to find out is that this woman kept her wine bottles in the cupboard under her sink. Most people don't do that. It's in a wine rack, it's in the refrigerator, whatever. And so from that, we know that this person was known to the victim. The weapon that was used wasn't brought to the house, so we know this was planned. They came here. Most people don't bring a tire iron into someone else's house. We also know that this person was familiar with the victim because they knew where they kept their wine. They were comfortable in the house because they went and got the bottle of wine, but they also started drinking it. So now, coupling that with the family photos that are down, I would say this is probably a relative in the extended family who didn't want the rest of the family looking at them as they committed this crime. I hope that answers your question.
That's completely fascinating. And I know that if anyone is planning to write kind of a scene like that in their books, this is a great jumping off point with the photos, face down and the blood on the
Right.
back. Like these are the kind of details, right, we live for as writers.
Yeah.
Gary O. Ross asked, what are signs of decompensating?
So I think it depends on that word is not a clinical word. It's more a description of thoughts and behaviors. So someone can be in an emotional spiral where they're, not sleeping, they're forgetting things, they're snapping at people, they're not making sense, they are getting into fights. And that can all be the result of a big emotional trigger. You can also have someone who is at the beginning of psychosis, and you might see them decompensating as the illness progresses and they start to be less and less in touch with reality. So it really depends on the underlying trigger and or mental health issue.
Nev asked the question, have you come across someone faking a mental illness to get a lower sentence?
Oh, yeah. Always. That's actually pretty common. Um, I I had someone he would tell me that he was psychotic. And he said, I'm hearing voices, I'm hearing them right now. But he wasn't very creative. And I just want to be clear, he was not psychotic. Um, but because he wasn't very creative, when I would say, what are the voices saying to you? He would just repeat back my last sentence. So he was not so good at faking. Um, but there are some people who spend a lot of time in, the library at the jail or the prison, and they read up on different mental health diagnoses, and they will try to, take trips to the infirmary and complain of these different things in order to get a diagnosis on their record. Um, which I don't really I don't really understand, because when someone is found NGRI, not guilty by reason of insanity, yes, it is absolutely zero culpability under the law. However, they are going to go to a secure psychiatric facility for longer than what their actual sentence in prison might be, because they're going to be hospitalized indefinitely until a judge determines that they're no longer a danger to themselves or to others. And for whatever the reason, people tend to mount insanity defenses in lesser crimes, like shoplifting. I mean, dude, you're going to be out in 30 days out of the county jail or whatever it is, don't go through the trouble. So, yeah, good
That's
question.
actually interesting.
Mhm.
I didn't realize that. Um, one thing that struck me was that whole sort of autonomic nervous system piece to the psychopath. Just is it like a low arousal or whatever it is, and they have to just really just keep hitting into um, this crazy, not crazy, this behavior to sort of get a rise out of people, right? I don't want to say crazy, to get a rise out of people. Is it because they have lower arousal too? I just want to make sure that I understand that. Or is it because they are trying to just get any kind of reaction at all?
For, wait, you said for the psychopaths?
Yeah, for the psychopath.
Um, it's fun for them. So they need to, yes, because they have the low arousal, they need to get that. They feel blah, they feel half in the bag all the time. So for them to feel some level of interest, or for their boredom to subside, they need to toy with people. And so when they get a reaction, it's like, oh, that's exciting. And then they can build on that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's fascinating. It really is. Okay, so I have another question from Nancy. Can you comment on when stalking behavior actually becomes a crime?
So this is not going to be a clinical response. I think stalking is underreported and undercharged because it's harder to prove. Stalking, I believe, is a felony as opposed to like harassment, which is a more minor offense. And I think most of the time, unfortunately, this is charged as harassment. And I think that by the second or third time, like someone is, it develops this pattern of inappropriate contact, unwanted contact. That's stalking, and it shouldn't be, oh, it's just harassment. So that's something that I take very seriously, because I've seen the escalation in that. And you don't want someone, it's very dangerous when someone with ill intentions knows where you live, they know your routine, they know what you drive. So I think, you know, I would like to say by the second escalation, I'd say it's stalking, and, we need law enforcement intervention.
Well, here's a question from Nancy, another different Nancy, and she's saying, I'm writing a female antagonist. She's in a position of absolute control due to her caring motherly behavior she's shown for decades. It's all a facade to her actual domineering, controlling personality. She kills her own husband who gets in her way, believing she's taking it too far. What label would you give her?
Hmm. I think some of it depends on, well, no. So she would be a cold-blooded killer. I don't know um necessarily if she would, like, if in the story she goes on to kill other people, if it's motivated by money, if they're people close to her, I would call her a Black Widow. Um Otherwise, she's just a cold-blooded female, but she is using gender to her benefit. So I would probably really play that up. Okay, all motivated by money and control. Yeah, so she has a lot of overlap with the Black Widow personality, but Black Widows are serial killers. So if she's not killing multiple people, then I would probably leave it at, cold-blooded. She doesn't have to have any kind of psychiatric diagnosis to kill people. Um, but I would just say the crimes are cold-blooded. These aren't hot-blooded, reactive homicides where there's an emotional upheaval and she snaps in the moment. These are planned, they're probably organized, they are very cold-blooded. And it sounds like she's a very self-centered and self-serving individual. I like her already. I want to read this.
Sounds like your kind of gal, Stephanie.
Right.
Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. As you said, you're an author. I've read your book, that hopefully everyone will have a chance to read it too soon. It's incredible. It dives into a lot of this stuff that you were talking about here about motivation and gender and perception and how people get away with murder. So thank you for taking us inside the criminal mind today. And I just wanted to say that next month we also have our Crime Craft in October. It's always the third Tuesday, so stay tuned for that. And we'll see everybody in October. Thanks for joining us, Steph.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. It's great.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
Bye.
Bye.